Many years ago, in the middle of the 20th century, America asked a young man to go to war. It was the time of the Second World War. The United States was engaged in World War II from December 7th, 1941 until August of 1945. It was a conflict which left few places on earth untouched. It was fought on all the oceans, in all the skies, on tropical islands, and in ancient cities. When that young man went off to war, he left his home, his family, his school, his job. He didn't know it at the time, perhaps, but this ordinary, everyday American and millions like him were being asked to save the world. Whether he was on the front line or the supply line, that young soldier helped us triumph in Europe. He helped to liberate conquered nations and bring an end to the terrible fighting. I'm Walter Cronkite. I believe we owe this soldier, your family's World War II veteran, an enormous debt of gratitude. We should never forget his courage, his sense of duty, his sacrifice. His contributions made possible the freedoms and life we all too often take for granted. I was a correspondent during that war. Despite all that's happened since then, nothing has made a bigger impression on me than the willingness of those young American soldiers to go beyond the call to duty. Because of their determination, America itself was changed, and the world as we know it today was born. I consider it a great honor to introduce the story your veteran will tell of his contribution to America's role in World War II. It's his story, told by him in his words, and it's a part of American history. Listen to this story and remember it. He's dedicating it to you, his family, and to all his descendants. This is the best part of our nation's heritage. It's real. It's the story of one veteran, one of those everyday heroes who saved the world. Honor him as I do.
My name is George Clark Cave. I was born in Kaufman, Texas on July 31st, 1922. My parents were Charlie and Beulah Rosalind Ayers Cave. I was the fifth of 6 children, 2 girls and 4 boys. We grew up on a farm about a mile northwest of Kaufman, Texas. Cotton was the major money crop, and we produced just about all of the meat and vegetables that we needed on the farm. Since we lived during the Great Depression, money was rather scarce. The local grocer, Mr. Herman Duncan, would buy eggs from the farm for 8 cents cash. I worked for him on Saturdays when I was 14, 15 years old. The house the family was living in when I was born burned in 1926. We grew up in the house that replaced it and which is still being lived in. We spent many wonderful days playing under the big oak trees in the front yard. I graduated from Kaufman High School when I was 16 years old. While in school, I was active in Future Farmers of America. I participated in various competitions, including milk judging, news writing, soil conservation, and cattle judging. The highlight of the school year was the annual banquet given by the school in appreciation for the several teams' accomplishments in the various competitions. My sister, Mary, and I went to Dallas and took the Federal Civil Service entrance examination. Upon graduation from high school, I enrolled in the Civilian Conservation Corps and was assigned to CCC Camp number 869, the soil conservation camp in Kaufman. Because I had taken typing in high school, I was assigned to the Soil Conservation Service as a clerk typist. After having worked there for several weeks, I was assigned to the educational advisor as his assistant. I was given classes to teach in typing and photography. I took classes in first aid conducted by the American Red Cross and earned both the standard and advanced certificates. The most eventful thing that happened during the 2 years that I was in the CCC was when a heavy rain threatened to destroy the dam of the City Lake at Terrell, Texas. If the dam broke, the city's water supply would have been lost, and I was a part of a crew sent to reinforce the dam with sandbags. We were successful, and a few weeks later, the city of Terrell had a barbecue to show their appreciation. The last several months that I was in the CCC, I was a supply steward, which was equivalent to supply sergeant in the Army. As supply steward, I had to drive a truck to the sub-district headquarters in Fort Worth once a month to get supplies. When my 2 years were up in the CCC, I left the camp and went to work for the Texas Highway Department as an engineer's assistant. I did not work for the Highway Department very long before I got a job with the Texas and New Orleans Railroad as a station porter. While working for the railroad, I received a telegram from the Civil Service Commission offering me a job with the Veterans Administration in Washington, D.C. I reported to the VA, and after having been there for about 2 weeks, received another telegram from the Civil Service Commission offering me a job with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. During the time I worked for RFC, I obtained a Red Cross First Aid Instructor Certificate and taught several classes as one of the youngest certified Red Cross instructors in Washington at that time. I worked for RFC several months, then resigned to work for a commercial photo finishing company. I did not work there very long before deciding to go to school. I enrolled at Freed-Hardeman College in Henderson, Tennessee for the fall semester of 1942. Not long after that, I realized that I would soon be drafted for military service in World War II. I had registered with the Selective Service Board in Kaufman, Texas, and reported there for induction into the Army the 1st of January, 1943. We were taken to Camp Walters in Mineral Wells, Texas, which was the induction center for that part of North Texas. We were issued uniforms, given orientation lectures in calisthenics, and a first series of inoculations. After about 2 weeks, I received orders assigning me to headquarters and headquarters detachment, Eastern Defense Command and 1st Army, stationed on Governor's Island, New York. My job there was as a typist in the office of the commanding general. After a few days, we were told to report to supply to be issued rifles. Since I had registered with the Selective Service Board as a conscientious objector, transferred to the medical detachment attached to an anti-aircraft unit at Providence, Rhode Island. I had been there perhaps a month when this anti-aircraft battery was given orders for overseas duty. We were moved to Camp Edwards on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, for embarkation overseas. An alert company clerk in reviewing personnel records discovered that I had not yet had basic training. I was sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, for reassignment for basic training. By this time, I had been in the Army for approximately 4 months. Fort Devens was a reception center for new inductees and a basic training center for new recruits in the Women's Army Corps, or WAC. I had been there only a day or two when the sergeant had us fall out one morning and told us he needed some truck drivers to take new draftees from Fort Devens to the train station for shipment to their basic training assignments. Since I had driven government-owned trucks while I was in the CCC camp, all I had to do was drive a truck around the block and be issued a government driver's license. This assignment excused us from all other duties, including KP and guard duties. One morning, we decided we would not report to the motor pool, but go down to Robbins Pond, where the WAC recruits were swimming. We were not called to the orderly room the next day, so we did it again. This continued for another week, and we were not asked about where we'd been. It finally occurred to us that the sergeant at the motor pool thought we had shipped out, and at the orderly room they thought we were reporting to the motor pool. We got away with it for another couple of weeks, and then I received orders for reassignment to Camp Grant near Rockford, Illinois, for medical basic training. We boarded the troop train on Monday morning. We arrived at Camp Grant just after midnight on Wednesday night. It was 3 o'clock on Thursday morning before we got to our quarters and were able to lie down. Our quarters consisted of pyramidal tents with a concrete slab floor, 5 men to a tent. At 6 o'clock, we were called to fall out for roll call. After breakfast, we began to settle into the routine of basic training and were formed up into platoon assignments. I was in the 3rd Platoon, C Company, 36th Medical Training Battalion. I was designated acting corporal. One of the duties was to command the platoon doing close order drill. Our platoon won the drill competition in C Company. Since I had a government driver's license, I was assigned to drive the ambulance following the line of march on cross-country marches to pick up stragglers or men who developed blisters and could not continue walking. Medical basic training included classes in first aid, how to apply dressings and bandages, basic pharmacology, and medica media. Medical basic training ended in October of 1943. By this time, temperatures began to fall in northern Illinois, and the tents we were in did not have heaters in them. I had a young dog as platoon mascot, and he slept in my cot under the blanket and kept my feet warm. This was the luxury that the other men did not enjoy. Toward the end of basic training, I applied for and was accepted to attend the school for X-ray technicians at Billings General Hospital, Fort Benjamin Harrison, near Indianapolis, Indiana. We were to get in 3 months the same training that a civilian school should take a year to provide. I was one of about 35 students in the class for X-ray technicians. Subjects included anatomy, osteology, processing X-ray film, and military preparedness. This latter included negotiating an infiltration course, which was simulated combat conditions. That meant crawling about 100 yards on the ground with live machine gun fire about 40 inches overhead. It was quite an experience. The first Sunday that I was free to go to Indianapolis, I found the Garfield Heights Church of Christ, and it was the practice of Mrs. Reed to invite visiting servicemen to their home for Sunday dinner. Many servicemen visited and sent their photographs to Mrs. Reed, who displayed them in a prominent place in her living room. Their oldest daughter, Evangeline, would become my wife after I returned from overseas. We finished our course of study in February 1943, and I was sent to Camp Reynolds, Pennsylvania, for reassignment. Not long after arriving, we were given inoculations for overseas assignment. The evening I received my shots, which made me run a temperature, I was assigned KP duty. I went to see the mess sergeant, and he said that he wanted the cooktops of all the coal-fired stoves in all 3 kitchens cherry red when I called the cooks at 3 o'clock the next morning. They were as he wanted and asked me if I would like to stay as permanent fire guard. In retrospect, it would have been a good way to sit out the war, but that did not appeal to me, so I declined the offer. On the afternoon of May 12, 1944, I was one of 500 unattached medics who aborted the SS John Ericsson at Boston Harbor. The John Ericsson had been built for a Swedish steamship line before being purchased by the United States government. She was a 35,000-ton luxury liner, and the beauty of her lines was apparent. There were upwards of 75 ships in our convoy, most of them tankers and freighters, taking supplies to troops already overseas. The crossing was uneventful except for little rough water the second day out, and an alert for a submarine after we'd been out about 7 days. The 500 medics were assigned bunks on the promenade deck, which was topside, and much better than the troops who were in the hold of the ship because of ventilation. We were detailed to set up first aid stations throughout the ship, and some were to work in the ship's hospital. We were issued Red Cross armbands, which authorized us to go anywhere on board ship that we wanted, even to the officer's deck, which was not as crowded as the enlisted men. I was one of a team who gave last-minute shots to the other troops on board. We gave about 4,000 typhoid and tetanus shots in 3 days. 2 meals were served each day, and it was not unusual for one to stand in line for as long as an hour before getting his food. I was permitted to eat in the diet kitchen of the ship's hospital, where we got 3 meals a day, just about anything we wanted. All brands of cigarettes were available tax-free, and many men bought them in quantity. The rumor had circulated that there was an extreme shortage of cigarettes where we were going, even though no one knew where that was. Some felt that we were headed for North Africa, some to England, and some felt we were headed for continental Europe. As it turned out, England was the right one, and we knew this when we were given a bulletin entitled "No England" several days before we landed. Every night we had some kind of entertainment in the officers' lounge. Roman Catholic and general Protestant religious services were conducted every evening. On the 11th day out of Boston, we sighted land. As we got closer, we could see it was the hills of Northern Ireland. The convoy split up. Part of it was to go to Glasgow, Scotland, part to Liverpool, and part to Southampton, England. It was thrilling to watch the ships as they fell into two lines abreast of each other to go through the minefields in the Irish Sea. As we came closer to Liverpool, we could see evidence of German bombings during the Blitz. We dropped anchor in the middle of the Mersey River at about 10 o'clock in the morning of May 26, 1944. As we marched to the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway Station, we were greeted with cheers and many thumbs-up signals. We boarded the train with first-class coaches, which were very comfortable. Our destination was Oulton Park, a replacement depot for Army Service Forces near the city of Chester. We were there for 10 days, listening to orientation lectures, drilling, and going on road marches. Finally, the day came when we were told to fall out with all of our equipment because we were being assigned to units. Since we'd been on the move for several weeks, this was welcome news. We were issued more K and C rations for our train ride toward the southeast from Oulton Park. My dad's parents had migrated to the United States from England in the middle of the 19th century, and we went through cities that he had heard his parents talk about, namely Birmingham, Banbury, and Coventry. Coventry had sustained massive damage from German air raids, having been almost wiped off the map during the Blitz. We arrived at Newbury, then were taken to Standon Manor, 2 miles south of Hungerford in Wiltshire, approximately 75 miles west of London. Standon Manor was built about 1740. It was one of many private homes requisitioned by the military for housing troops in preparation for the invasion of continental Europe. I was assigned to the 326 Airborne Medical Company of the 101st Airborne Division, and we found out later that the approximately 50 of us were replacements for casualties anticipated to be incurred during the Normandy landings. As it turned out, there were more replacements than there were casualties. Part of us were billeted at Standon Manor and part at Templeton House, a few miles away that served as company headquarters. We arrived at the company on June 4, 1944, less than 48 hours before D-Day began. The older members of the company were already in the marshaling area when we arrived, so all we did was to go to class, drill, have calisthenics, and keep the place clean until they returned. On the night of June 5, 1944, at about 9 p.m., troop-carrying planes began flying overhead and circling for rendezvous with others for the flight across the English Channel to France. Tow planes with gliders began circling to rendezvous with other flights to go to Normandy. This kept up for the rest of the night, and even though that we had no way of knowing for sure, we were convinced that the invasion of continental Europe had begun. The endless stream of planes and gliders was the most impressive sight that I have ever seen. After about a month of restriction to the area of Standon Manor, the new arrivals welcomed back the men returning from Normandy. There had been casualties. The medical company was bombed on D-Day +3 by a German dive bomber which dropped 2 bombs. One exploded on contact with the ground and the other had a delayed action fuse. It left a huge crater and killed several men from the medical company. For continuing to operate under these conditions, the medical company was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. When the company returned from Normandy, we were given our permanent assignments. The 326th Airborne Medical Company was made up of both paratroops and glider men. I was assigned to gliders, and we began instruction. When we completed the indoctrination period, we were awarded our glider troop wings. Since I had been trained as an X-ray technician, I was assigned to the treatment section. Our first job was to resupply the medical and surgical chests, mark new tents with the Red Cross required by the Geneva Convention, and equip new jeeps and trailers for the next mission. One week, Harry came to see me, and we were together for the entire weekend. We walked around the city of Reading and took some pictures. We were ordered to the marshaling area on the 15th of September. This time, we felt that it was the real thing. We were briefed for this mission, which was to be in Holland. Our landing zone was 2 miles north of the small Dutch village of Zaan. At about 9 o'clock on the morning of September 17, 1944, C-47s bearing paratroops began taking off. Our glider train began taking off an hour later. I was in the 29th glider in the first lift to take off on that first day of the invasion of Holland as a part of Operation Market Garden. The Dutch civilians were very helpful in locating German gun emplacements in strongly fortified areas and recovering and evacuating wounded soldiers to the medical aid stations and to our hospital. The 101st Airborne Division Association has erected a monument to the Dutch people at St. Odenrode, Holland, for their help during the operation. I was a member of the Honor Guard when the memorial was unveiled in 1994 at the 50th anniversary of our landings. It is the only memorial ever erected to the people of an invaded country by the forces who invaded it. Operation Market Garden was a joint operation with the American 101st Airborne Division, the American 82nd Airborne Division, a British Airborne Division, and a Polish brigade. These units composed the 1st Allied Airborne Army. The 101st Division was to secure the bridge across the Wilhelmina Canal at Zaan and the highway to Nijmegen, approximately 20 miles to the north. The 82nd Division was to secure the bridge across the Waal River at Nijmegen and the highway from there to Arnhem. The British and Polish troops were to secure the bridge across the Rhine River at Arnhem, but were not successful. The bridge at Arnhem became known as the Bridge Too Far. Even though some of the gliders encountered problems with fog during the Channel crossing, our flight was uneventful until we got over Belgium. Since we were flying at low altitude, we could see small arms fire on the ground and hear bullets as they passed through the fabric on the wings and fuselage of the glider. Our landing was uneventful, but I was on the ground for just a few minutes when two gliders collided at an altitude of about 150 feet. They fell to the ground a short distance from where I was, and my introduction to combat medicine was to help with the men on board. The pilot was pinned against the front of the glider by the jeep that had broken loose when they crashed. The co-pilot seat was occupied by an airborne lieutenant who was critically injured also. Both men were taken from the wreckage, treated for their injuries, and evacuated through medical channels when the ambulance company arrived a few days later. The 326 Medical Company set up operating rooms in a Dutch hospital on one side of the main highway, and Sergeant Wayne Eaton from Oklahoma and I were assigned to set up an aid station in a Catholic school across the highway. During the first night, we could hear German tanks nearby, and one was knocked out approximately a half mile from where we were. The exchange of fire became intense, and we moved our aid station to the basement of the school. The Germans had blown the bridge over the canal, but men of the 326th Airborne Engineers soon had a replacement in place. By the time British troops broke through to us, we had accumulated several hundred wounded. We were able to evacuate the wounded to hospitals in safer areas. When the highway had been secured, we moved north to Nijmegen and we set up in a school building and began functioning as a full-service hospital. We came into possession of a portable x-ray machine. It was the first opportunity that I'd had to make x-rays in the field, and it was a great help to the doctors. It was in Nijmegen that I heard a jet airplane for the first time. I learned later that it was a new German jet plane which dropped a bomb that hit in back of our hospital, killing 2 officers and 1 enlisted man. While we were at Nijmegen, the company maintained an aid station just outside of the Dutch town of Elst. By this time, the action had stabilized, and the 101st Airborne Division was relieved and sent to Montmollon-le-Grand, near Reims, France. We were to resupply and get replacements for the men lost in Holland. We settled into the routine of everyday military life. During the time at Montmollon, I had 1 pass and went into the city of Chalon-sur-Marne, and it was the only time that I was able to go on pass before the division was called to go into action again in what was to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Without much advance notice, we were ordered onto trucks for the ride north and east to Belgium, and the 326 Medical Company set our hospital tents up at Crossroad X. The idea was that we could receive casualties from every direction at that location. We were set up and had begun receiving casualties when, at about 11 o'clock in the evening, on the night of December 19, 1944, a German armored unit came up one of the roads leading to our installation and opened fire with small arms and machine guns. Our tents were plainly identified with huge red crosses painted on the top, but that made no difference. During the firing, which continued for about 15 minutes, everyone was as close to the ground as we could get. There were no foxholes or other means of protection. There was a loud explosion near my left leg, and my entire left lower extremity went numb. I began feeling for my left thigh and ran my hands down the rest of my left leg, and was very happy to find that my foot was still intact. Either a grenade or a shell had exploded near my left foot, sending small fragments of shrapnel into my left ankle. The Germans loaded some of the patients we had received for treatment onto our trucks, and me along with them, because of my injury. We were driven into the town of Houffalize that night, and we sat there in the back of the truck all the next day. I was the only member of the 326 Medical Company to be wounded that night. The rest of the company had to march back into Germany or be transported in boxcars. We were about to cross the Rhine River at Koblenz near midnight on about the 3rd night, when our trucks were stopped and all of us ordered into a ditch alongside the road with our faces toward the ground and told not to look up. Before long, the entire area was as bright as day, and the loudest sound that I have ever heard, lasting for several seconds, gradually faded away, and we were ordered back onto the trucks. The Germans had launched one of their V-2 rockets. On Christmas Eve night, the British were bombing a railroad yard about 5 miles from the Stalag, and several of the bombs fell in the Stalag, and one hit a barracks housing about 100 feet from the building I was in. It was totally destroyed, killing everyone in it. We did not have any means of protection from air raids, and it was terrifying, listening to bombs falling and not being able to take shelter. Because I was a medic, when I was able to be on my feet, I was kept at Stalag 12A to help care for the approximately 125 sick and wounded prisoners who could not be transported further into Germany. I was issued German dog tags with the German serial number 12400. The American medical officer in charge of the sick bay was Lieutenant Thomas U. Johnson from Pennsylvania. I remember him asking one of the German doctors to order some penicillin, and the German did not know what he was talking about. Lieutenant Johnson told him that it was a very good antibiotic, and the German said that it could not be very good because it was not mentioned in the German medical literature. On occasion, seriously ill or injured prisoners were taken to a German civilian hospital in Limburg about 5 miles away. One day I was assisting in taking a prisoner to the hospital in Limburg, and the air raid siren sounded just as he was being admitted to the hospital. The patients were not evacuated from the hospital, but the other American medic and I were taken to the civilian air raid shelter by the German guard who had accompanied us. We were in the shelter for more than an hour while American bombers flew overhead. It was an uneasy feeling being in an air raid shelter with German civilians while an American bomber were flying overhead. Limburg was not their target, so when the all clear sounded, we were very relieved to be back out in the open. Life as a prisoner of war can be very boring. All of us were infested with lice, and it was a favorite pastime to sit around killing the lice in the seams of our trousers. Our rations were meager. We were given a great deal of soup, usually containing a lot of barley, and never any meat. One day a dog appeared at the Stalag, and we saw it for a few days, and it disappeared. The next day we had meat in our soup, and we never saw the dog again. The beds that we slept on were nothing more than wooden platforms with sides about 6 inches high to contain straw. The straw in the blankets was infested with lice too, and there was no relief from them. Since the only heat in the barracks was from the coal-fired space heater in the large room, there was not much heat for most of the winter, which was the coldest for that part of Europe in many years. Near midnight one night, about the middle of March, the Stalag commander came and told Lieutenant Johnson that he was going to evacuate the Stalag because the Allies were getting near the Rhine River and would soon be across it. He wanted the ambulatory patients to help transport those who could not walk to a railroad siding some distance away. Lieutenant Johnson explained that the ambulant patients were in no condition to carry anyone else. We could leave the non-ambulant patients with food and provisions, and they should be back in Allied hands and receive medical attention in a few days. That seemed to make sense to the commandant, and that's what was done. When we were put on the train, we were put in boxcars and the doors were locked. The first day out, American fighter planes strafed us, inflicting further injury to some of the prisoners. Lieutenant Johnson was the only one available to render aid. He explained to the train commandant that if the 2 enlisted medics were with him in the guard car, all 3 of us would be available when needed, and the guards would know where to find us. He also reminded the commandant that the Geneva Convention required that the train be identified as a POW train. Both of these suggestions were carried out. Since we had been moved to the guard car, we, as medics, had free run of the train. One of the older men who had been conscripted to perform guard duty was named Krause. The train only moved at night and remained as concealed as possible during the day. Herr Krause became friendly with the 3 of us medics, and during the day he would go into a nearby village and bring back pieces of fruit, bread, or other goodies to share with us, and sometimes information about progress of the war. One day he came back from a visit into a village and told us that it would not be long before we would be free. He said the Americans were getting close to the Rhine River and soon would be across it. The next several days were uneventful. One morning we found that during the night we had come into a rail yard in the village of Solms in Germany. I saw 2 P-47 fighter planes coming in low on a strafing run and hit the engine, causing it to explode. Since the railroad bridges had been blown ahead of us as well as behind us, we were stranded in the rail yard at Solms with no engine. The German army guards had left the train, leaving Herr Krause as our only guard. Before they left, the Germans destroyed the anti-aircraft gun mounted on the flat car. I was standing on the car the gun was on before it was blown, and fortunately for me, the German assigned to blow it up told me what he was going to do, and I was able to get away before the explosion. We unlocked the boxcars so the other prisoners could go off the train too. Lieutenant Johnson, the other enlisted medic, and I, with Herr Krause as our guard, went into the village and found many heavily armed German soldiers patrolling the streets. The next morning, an artillery spotter plane flew over at low altitude. Everyone began waving and calling to the pilot, and he dipped his wings to the plane in recognition. We knew that it would not be long before American troops would be arriving. Herr Krauss had said that he was going to embrace the first American he saw coming with the liberating troops. I shall never forget the scene as, with tears streaming down his face, he embraced a burly American sergeant. That afternoon, an American Army truck arrived with a load of white bread. None of us had eaten white bread for several months, and it was almost like eating cake. The next day, we were evacuated through medical channels to an American hospital. The first thing we did on arrival back in American hands was go to a delousing station where we were dusted thoroughly with DDT powder, our uniforms burned, and new uniforms issued. We were the first recovered Allied military personnel, or RAMPs, to be sent to the hospital at Bar-le-Duc, France. It was at the hospital that I learned President Roosevelt had died. I was transferred to a hospital at Montmollon-le-Grand, where we had been before we were captured. I was standing on a company street looking for a vehicle with the 326 Medical Company identification stenciled on the bumper, and when one came by, I stopped it and identified myself to the driver. I asked about our company commander, Major Barfield, who was not captured in December, and was told that he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and was now a division surgeon. I asked the driver to tell him that one of the men captured in December was hospitalized there, and the next day Colonel Barfield sent for me. He told me that he would see that I would be promoted from private first class to a sergeant if I would come back to the outfit. I smiled and told him, "Sir, I'm on my way home." Shortly after that, I was transferred by train to a hospital at Newton Abbott. I shall never forget the music being played over the PA system when the bus loaded with ramps arrived at the hospital. It was "Don't Fence Me In." Harry came to visit shortly after I arrived there. A few days later, I was flown to Prestwick, Scotland. We were fingerprinted to be checked by the FBI. The war was not over in Japan, and it was feared the Germans would try to infiltrate spies into the United States through ramp channels. We were in Prestwick for about 10 days before boarding an Army Transport Service C-54 for the flight back to the good old USA. It was while I was in the hospital at Newton Abbott that I was presented the Purple Heart Medal for the injury that I had received the night I was captured. We flew to Waco, Texas, and were transferred by bus to McCloskey General Hospital at Temple, Texas. By the time I arrived at the hospital, all former POWs were being given 60-day furloughs, so I decided to go to Washington, D.C. and renew acquaintances with some of the people I had known there in 1942. I remembered the Reed family and decided to stop over and visit them. During the week I spent with the Reeds, Evangeline and I decided we would be married. We were married at the Garfield Heights Church of Christ following the evening worship service on July 8, 1945. Since my 60-day furlough was about over, I left Van with my family in Kaufman and reported back to McCloskey General Hospital in Temple, and it was there for another week before I being discharged from the Army on August 10, 1945. We went back to Indianapolis and lived with the Reed family, and I went looking for work and was hired by the Beeler, Collins, and Lohr X-ray Clinic in Indianapolis. In late December, we found that Van was pregnant and decided to move back to Texas. We lived with my cousins, Charlie and Dot Hampton. Charlie worked at the U.S. Post Office and was able to get a job for me sorting mail. I decided I would be happier doing X-ray, so I found a job with Dr. Norman Beaver, who operated a private clinic in the Medical Arts Building near downtown Dallas. And on September 3, 1946, our first son, Ronald Wayne, was born. I worked in the X-ray department at the VA hospital in Dallas until the spring of 1948, when we decided to move back to Indianapolis. At that time, Van was pregnant with our first set of twins, Philip Dean and Stephen Lane. The twins were born on June 11, 1948. I worked at the Cold Spring Road VA Hospital until I learned about a position at the VA Hospital in Temple, Texas. The VA had taken over McCloskey General Hospital, where I had been discharged from the Army, and it was almost like coming home. We moved back to Indianapolis and had been there about a year when our fourth son, Douglas Bryan, was born. Our second twins, Winona Gale and Wendell Eugene, were born on March 25, 1955, and our seventh child, Kevin Brent, on November 5, 1957. We lived in Beech Grove, Indiana, until August of 1967, when we moved to Gainesville, Florida, where I accepted the position of Chief Medical Illustration Service at the new VA hospital under construction. I retired in 1982 after 37 years in federal service. When I returned to Holland in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, the Dutch cities of Eindhoven and Best presented me with medals in appreciation for what we had done for their cities. At a program in Bastogne, Belgium, I was presented a large commemorative coin in appreciation for what the division had done there during the Battle of the Bulge. The Second World War was fought by peace-loving people in order to preserve the freedoms that we in the United States enjoy today. I have not lived under a totalitarian ruler, but I have met people who have, and it is frightening to imagine what the world would be like if we had lost World War II. I am the father of 6 sons and 1 daughter, and 2 of the sons have served in the United States Marine Corps. I am proud of them for that, but I am equally proud of our other children. We are fortunate to live in a land that provides the freedoms that we enjoy today. We must never let our guard down and constantly be on the alert for politicians who are more interested in personal power than in the best interests of our wonderful country. I want to dedicate this to my 3 brothers, Charles and Harry, who served in the United States Air Force, and Edward, who was in the United States Navy during World War II, and to all the young men and women who are in uniform around the world protecting our freedoms today.